Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week we are talking about an uncommonly powerful commander, Araumi of the Dead Tide. Araumi of the Dead Tide is an uncommon 3-mana Dimir Merfolk wizard from the new Commander Legends set. She's a 1/4 that can tap and exile cards from our graveyard equal to the number of opponents we have to give target creature card in our graveyard encore until the end of the turn, the encore cost being equal to its mana cost. When we encore a creature, we'll exile that creature card from our graveyard and pay its mana cost, and then for each opponent we'll create a token copy of that creature that attacks that opponent this turn if able. Those tokens of course will have haste, and then crucially we will sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. And of course, we can only use this ability at sorcery speed. Araumi's EDHREC page honestly reminds me of my Marin of Clan Naltoth deck. Imagine encoring some of these creatures. A single Grey Merchant of Asphodel means that at minimum, each opponent is losing 21 life and we're gaining 63. Now, typically, I would avoid creating a video about a commander this close to its release. That way the data can get more time to accumulate and to settle. But in this case, Araumi's actually just knocking it out of the park. She's competing with Obeka as the most popular commander from the most recent set, Commander Legends. And not only that, but Araumi's even competing with heavy hitters like the famous Golos Tireless Pilgrim in terms of the most popular commanders built within the past week and the past month. In other words, I'm feeling pretty good about the stuff that we're seeing for Araumi so far. And since we're kind of in a building frenzy right now, let's see if we can help everyone out who's been diving into those deadly depths. Alright, let's get Araumi's average decklist from EDHREC and import it into the Architect deck building website. As always, the swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. Bravo! Brava! The crowd cheers for an encore. This list has some really great creatures to bring back, and tons of cool spells to help fill the yard with revival targets in the first place. I'm especially impressed with cards like the Sundial of the Infinite or the enchantment there, Teferi's Veil, which are really clever tricks to help Araumi keep the encore tokens instead of sacrificing them on the end step. It just goes to show you can never really be sure what's going on down there in the ocean's murky abyss. Alright, let's adjust this list in the following 3 ways. First, we'll explore the shore. Next, the Downpour. And finally, the Riptide. We'll start with the shore. After all, it's not just about the water, but also the land that leads us there. The very first thing that struck me about Araumi's page was the 32 lands there at the top. That's definitely something we have to address. Here at EDHREC, this is actually a phenomena that is kind of common for us to see whenever data starts pouring in for a brand new commander. In all the rush for players to stuff a bunch of cool, crazy ideas to see what works for that new snazzy commander deck, the number of lands required kind of tends to be undershot a little. So as we collect the data, that then bleeds over into the recommendations that get displayed on the site. Everyone's still brainstorming right now, so that means that the number of non-land cards kind of gets overrepresented since everyone's decks are so full to the brim with them. Thankfully, this trend does correct itself over time. Once players actually start getting reps in with the deck list, that helps them identify which cards were good in theory, but didn't actually end up being all that good in practice. And that means that they'll cut them to make room for more mana, which will help make the deck more consistent. So literally, I'm just trying to prepare you for the fact that I will be cutting cool-looking cards to make room for lands. Which I know the lands aren't as fun or astonishing, but we need them to cast spells. I'll just add 1 basic, and then I want to add 2 colorless lands as well. One is Ash Barrens. This helps us color fix, but it can also end up as a land in the graveyard that we can exile for Araumi's ability. After that, I also want to throw in that new Guildless Commons card. It's kinda silly, but bounce lands can be incredible for graveyard decks like this. Most of the time, when you play them on turn 2, you'll end up with 8 cards in your hand, and must then discard to hand size. I've used this trick to get free discards before, and it's frankly silly how good that can actually wind up being down the line. The cuts I'm making in this section will feel weird, but hear me out. I'm chopping one of the mana rocks here, Charcoal Diamond. I just don't really like these diamonds in 2-color decks. The counterpart blue version, Sky Diamond, isn't here after all. And I'm not adding in another mana rock to replace this one, but don't worry, I will explain why very soon. The other cut I'll make in this section is Priest of Gix. This one's funny because if it's Encored, you'll get 9 mana from this ability. However, I'm not quite sold on that. I mean, that scenario is cool, but we have other creatures that do something similar to that already, namely Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake. Those ones untap lands, and if they're Encored, we can tap the lands for mana between each untapped trigger, so we'll float like tons of mana. I like them a lot better than the Priest of Gix because the Cloud of Fairies, for instance, has a cycling ability to slam right into the yard, but also these cards let us hold up mana on other turns if necessary, which gives them more usefulness even when they aren't Encored. Priest of Gix is a really cool ability here, but I don't think that it will actually end up being the thing that we want to Encore most of the time. More on that later. For now, we'll just move right into Section 2, the Downpour. Araumi's ability requires us to have cards in the graveyard that we are willing to exile. We can't just have the individual creature as a reanimation target. We need to have other cards there too that we are willing to lose forever. So this section is to help us dig a bunch of cards into the yard, both to find really cool Encore targets and to make sure that we can keep that exile requirement fed. I've got like 6 spells that I want to throw in this section, but before I get there, I have to stop and make a pair of cuts that I think the comment section will call me pretty crazy for. I'm tossing out Gravebreaker Lamia and Corpse Connoisseur. I've been playing Reanimator and Necromancy strategies in Commander for over a decade. I have 4 or 5 Reanimator decks currently and a bunch more on the cutting room floor, and I don't use these cards in any of them. I have some experience in this area, so just hear me out. That's all I ask. These cards are 5 mana for an Entomb effect, which is a lot of mana for that effect. Gravebreaker Lamia also has a cost reduction ability, but that cost reduction doesn't actually work on Araumi's ability. Encore is an activated ability, not a cast. So these are 2 5-mana cards that can toss a specific card from our deck into the yard. In theory, this is good. I mean, why skimp on Entomb effects, after all? Plus, Araumi can Encore these creatures if need be to get even more cards into the yard. However, like I said, that all sounds good in theory, but I don't think it really works all that well in practical gameplay. To put it bluntly, these are not the cards that we want to have to Encore. That's an option that will technically be available to us, but not one I think we'll actually ever want to take. After all, when was the last time you saw someone use the Unearth ability on Corpse Connoisseur? But even if you don't believe me, at least heed the data. Earlier, I compared Araumi to Marin of Clan Nultoth, another commander that wants to revive a creature from the yard for big enter the battlefield effects. Marin will try to loop a Grey Merchant like 3 times, while Araumi does that all at once. They're not identical, but they're similar enough. Anyway, Gravebreaker only shows up in 18% of Marin decks, and Corpse Connoisseur doesn't show up on her page at all. Connoisseur barely even appears very much in zombie tribal decks, and the most play it ever seems to enjoy is in niche commanders like Isareth or Whisper. Digging further, Lamia is showing up in a decent number of Gen decks so far, but that's where it takes advantage of the fact that the Lamia is an enchantment. Note also that Lamia's next most popular commander in line, Chainer, is a commander that casts creatures from the yard, and he even only plays Lamia like 36% of the time. That number used to be a lot bigger, by the way. It used to be above 50%, but over time, it's gone down. Even Muldrotha of the Gravetide, a commander for whom Gravebreaker Lamia was like directly designed, only plays the Lamia about a quarter of the time. Now, none of this, not a single word of this, should be interpreted as me trying to say that these cards are bad or unplayable or anything like that. Like, these are fine cards, and if you're on a budget, that's a really big notch in their favor, let's be real. But, for this particular average deck list where things are currently sitting, yeah, there are some moments where these particular cards are a bit clunky compared to the rest of what we've got going on here. And for Araumi's particular purposes, we've got some other methods that we can use to get those same abilities while also feeding into her other requirements. Tutor effects help find cards to put into the yard, but there's something else we can do to help that happen, one that addresses a problem Araumi will occasionally encounter. Sometimes she runs out of cards to exile. While other Reanimator decks don't mind if there's only one creature card in the graveyard, Araumi can't Encore without exile fodder. So the cards I want to add here will help make sure there's always enough in the graveyard for us to work with. See, I left the list at 35 lands, which is actually a lot lower than I would normally feel comfortable with. But there are methods in which 35 lands can actually be perfectly enough, and one of them happens to be a thing that this deck wants to do anyway. I'm talking about filtering. The original deck has great ways of filling the yard while sculpting our hand with whatever we need. Ancient Excavation, Frantic Search, Forbidden Alchemy, Factor Fiction, Careful Study, and so on. These effects let us toss out big creatures from our hand, but they also go to the graveyard themselves, ripe for Araumi to use them as fodder to Encore a smashy creature. So the more we filter, the more likely we are to draw the mana sources we need and toss away whatever we don't. So this not only helps us put the creatures we want in the yard into the yard, but also smooths out our mana base. So I want to add more to that. Thus, Thirst for Knowledge and Thirst for Meaning are my first additions. These have honestly been some of my favorite spells for this type of effect, especially because they're instants, and after casting them, our hand remains card neutral. There are two others I'll add though that increase the number of cards we wind up with in hand. Notion Rain and Funeral Rites. They also put 3 cards into the yard, but we also get card advantage. I'll do one more here too to partner up with that Windfall in the average list. Whispering Madness. It's 4 mana, but it's similar enough to be very useful. You get a lot of cards into the yard this way. Just make sure to watch out for enemy Smothering Tithes. I'd recommend Mesmeric Orb and Jace's Archivist in this section as well, but they're a little more pressure on the budget. Don't forget about them though. Adding spells like these makes me feel better because it shores up a hole in Araumi strategy. Not only that, but it helps smooth out a lack of tutors because we've gone for an accuracy by volume approach that will let us dig a lot more than before. The more cards we're filtering and drawing this way, the more options we'll end up with in our graveyard, the more fodder we'll have to exile, and the better our mana situation will end up being. So these are pitch-perfect inclusions for Araumi to make sure that our deck remains well-balanced. There are a few other cards I'm going to chop before I go, though. They also help us fill the yard, but they do it a little too overzealously. The first is Court of Cunning. This card gives us the Monarchy, and if we stay the Monarch, we can mill ourselves by 10 cards each turn. If we lose the Monarchy, we can still mill ourselves by 2 each turn. The thing is, these particular colors are not great at keeping the Monarchy. I just don't really trust our ability to hold on to the crown, so this has the potential to give more advantage to enemies than I'm personally comfortable with. On that note, I'm cutting Mr. Stinkweed too. I love this thing in my Conrad deck, but there's a reason this card doesn't appear in many of the more traditional Reanimator decks. This isn't a graveyard filling method that will be as reliable as our other options. The next one is Dream Eater, which was a pretty painstaking card to cut, to be honest, but 6 mana just hurts. We want our filtering and loading up effects at the lower points of the mana curve to help smooth out our early game. This card isn't, useless in the late game or anything, but it's also just not the snazziest Encore target either. And I think that ought to segue us nicely into the third section, the deadliest part of the deck, the Riptide. I want to circle back to that discussion about which creatures we actually intend to use the Encore ability on. There are a lot of really cool creatures that would provide a ton of value if we use the Encore ability on them, but let's pause for a moment and reflect on how an Encore will actually go down. We have to fill the graveyard, deploy Araumi, make sure that Araumi doesn't die for a full round, and then on the turn that we're going to Encore, we have to make sure that we can pay the mana cost for that creature, which is likely to take up most of our mana for that turn. My point is that that's a wave that requires some time to build up, and the longer we have to wait for that moment, the more impactful we'll want it to be. We don't want it to just be the shallows, we want it to be a tsunami. But on the flip side, the more dangerous our opponents know that moment will be, the less likely they are to let us build to it. In other words, it is just very, very unlikely for us to get away with encoring creatures just for value. The flexibility that we've got here where we can pick any creature in our graveyard, that's true, but it's also kind of an illusion because we want to hit the biggest and most impressive targets, which is probably all that our opponents will let us even have time with. It can happen, but I don't see a world where we're allowed to encore a creature every single turn unopposed. For one thing, that's not really sustainable because we'd run out of cards to exile, but for another thing, we have opponents who exist and want to kill us. To make a long story short, which I know, too late, this is where I want us to hone the Encore options that we've got, because we just don't have time for every single one of them to make a repeat performance. Let's examine the heavy hitters we have so far. Agent of Treachery is really vindictive and really good. And way down here, Vindictive Lich is really nasty, since remember, the Encore tokens are sacrificed, not exiled. The Primordials are also really great. There's Grey Merchant here too, of course, and if we didn't have a budget restriction, Kokosho would be right at home here for sure. Massacre Worm is also one hell of a beatdown, as is Grave Titan, especially since the Encore copies will attack that same turn. On our off turns where we're not encoring a total banger of a creature, we've got some other great ones to help us stabilize. Reviving 3 Fleshbag Marauders, for example, will keep that board very clear, and encoring a Zubera or a Gonti is also a really nice influx of cards to consider. What's important about these is that they're good whether we encore them or not. So now I'm gonna get to swapping, because there are some here that I'm not as keen on encoring. Gyruda is the first. It fills the yard, true, but I've seen this thing whiff a couple of times now, and the fact that it's legendary means that encoring it is less appealing. It would still get 3 of these triggers, but they're unwieldy, and we have other things we could be doing instead. Then there's Kaiga. Encoring this means we get to steal 3 creatures. the thing is, a lot of things have to go right for that effect to be worth it. This payoff is situational, and that sours it in Araumi's eyes. Rakshasa Debaser I really want to like, but I just don't. The ability is neat in theory, but it's too slow and unreliable for us to work around properly. And finally, Cavalier of Night draws my eye. I wanted to like this one here, but the mana cost is a lot, and it requires a sacrifice to make the first ability work in the first place, a restriction not shared by other black creatures that we could play in this slot instead. Plus, since we have to exile stuff from our yard, I'm dubious about how often its death trigger will even work. Sorry, Cavalier, better luck next deck. Okay, so what are we adding to get this deck back to 100 cards? Well, I've actually got 2 creatures and 1 spell to recommend. The first is a creature that we won't even really encore, but it blends in with Dimir things so well that it's a shame not to use it when we have the chance to. We added Notion Rain earlier, and this is Notion Thief. This thing's sick when we cast that Windfall, but it also looks at new cards like AC and holds up a very big stop sign. This might read as a card that doesn't really fit in because it doesn't have direct synergies with Araumi. There's the potential accusation that Notion Thief is just a good stuff card. But again, Windfall is amazing synergy here, and also this card can draw us a lot of cards, like a lot, which has the added bonus of overflowing our hand and filling the yard in some absolutely perfect and frankly disgusting ways. My next addition here is to help us with that sundial of the infinite in the average list. This deck really likes discontinuity. Encore something good, then keep it for 2 mana. Or, in the late game, when we don't want an opponent to go off on their turn, we can stop time and assert our dominance. I'm personally really pleased with the Encore targets already in the main deck, hence why the majority of this video has been helping us grease the wheels rather than adding tons of flashy new bombs. That said, I want to end with what I think might be my favorite Encore target ever, Sower of Discord. When it enters, we tether 2 players' life totals together. If one takes damage, the other loses that much life too. When we encore this, we can select the same 2 players 3 times. Then, as long as one of those players has no way to block our Hasty Flying Demon, we can get in for a guaranteed 6 damage on them, which means the other one is for sure taking 18 even if they can block. And if neither of them has a good block, then this will happen for both players. There's a lot of trickery we can pull off with this card, so give it a shot and watch your opponents laugh as this hilarious card wipes their life totals away. Alright, I think that ought to do it. You can find a link to the full list below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed Araumi's performance, and if you're in the mood for more, you can encore this video by liking, commenting, subscribing, or make it like Araumi and watch it 3 more times. If you've got any other recommendations for your fellow Dead Tide surfers, make sure that you also leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.